Okay, and I'm back, guys. And this is going to be the last video in this little series, because after this, really, there's not a lot more I can cover. I've covered kind of the basics so far of like setups and ifs and loops, and they're mainly what you end up using. Here, I will cover one more thing that I've briefly mentioned. I mentioned the on-trigger enter and on-trigger exit functions and how you can use them. And this video, I'll be showing you how to use them as for the feature that I'm going to program. And this lesson, or this video, I'm going to be programming a basic turret that will look at the player and fire at him every 3 seconds. And the player will take damage and register when he has been killed, so to speak, although I'm not going to set up any kill code. I'm just going to set it to print when the player has been shot. Okay, so first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly make a player health script. And I'm going to create a C# script. I'm going to call it shoot for health script. And if I open it up in MonoDevelop, I obviously have them all set up already. And thankfully this script doesn't need to be anything particularly complex. All it needs is a public int player health. And that's going to be equal to 100 because that's a fairly standard health amount. And I'm going to write a custom function for taking damage. So I'm going to make it a public function, so it can be accessed by any script outside of this one. And it's going to be a void because it doesn't need to return anything. And then take damage. And then I'm going to send it an argument. And I briefly mentioned arguments before and how you can use them to send. You basically use them to send values to a function. So in this case, I'm going to make an int damage amount. And basically now, within this function, whenever I use damage amount, it will be equal to the value that it is sent, and I'll have to cover the specifics of that in a second. So what I'm going to do is, in here, I'm just going to get player health, and I'm going to set it to be equal to player health minus damage amount. So when the player takes damage, player health is set to be itself minus the damage amount which it is sent. So that means like you can have a bullet which will do like maybe 20 damage, a bomb which will do maybe 50 damage, and in each of the kind of projectile scripts you will then send it a specific damage value from that script, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to put print. Well, first off I'm going to check if player health is equal to 0. I'm going to print you died. And then I'm going to do an else. So, sorry. And I'm going to print damage taken, remaining health. And I'm going to add on player health at the end there. And I'm going to quickly cover something that I noticed when I actually first made this script. I messed it up by basically putting the code where it takes away the health after this writing line. So it printed that the player's health was 100 and then took the damage off to be 50. You want to take off the damage first and then obviously print. You need to make sure in code you get stuff the right way around or unexpected results happen. Basically, 90% of the errors that you're going to get are forgetting semicolons and maybe putting stuff in the wrong order, and it won't behave as expected. That's generally why my errors go. I just put something in the wrong place, and then when you switch it into the right place, it all works fine. Correct code, wrong place. Generally ends up being the issue. So that's actually it for the health script, and without switching into the Unity in the video, I'm going to make another script. I'm just going to call it shoot for turret script. Okay, and I'm going to open the turret script here. Now the turret script is a little bit more involved, and it actually will require some work in the Unity engine itself. Okay, so in Unity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create let's make a cylinder. It's a shame I can't make like hexagonal ones, because that would be pretty cool for what I'm kind of going to do here. And I'm going to quickly scale it down a bit. I'm gonna put it just like that. And then basically to make kind of a turret effect, what I'm gonna just do is I'm going to come under this and I'm gonna go to create 3D object. No, I'm gonna create an empty, and this is basically gonna act as the pivot for my actual turret section. So I'm gonna set it to be just above the box, so you can see it's just above the actual base of it, and then I'm gonna name that turret pivot. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to make a 3D object underneath that, and I'm going to make it a cube. And then I'm just going to scale it down, maybe to 0.25 by 0.25. Nope, okay, I want to set the X value to 0.25 to make sure that it scales that way. Okay, and then I'm going to move it along so that the box is kind of at the end of that pivot, and if I rotate the pivot, you can see the box moves with it, and that's going to be your kind of targeting gun section. The reason I made that empty game object is to allow the pivot to be there, because if I just child the cube to the cylinder, you can see the cube rotates around the wrong position. So by childing it to a empty game object, the pivot changes to be there. That's something you just kind of got to get used to, really. It's a bit of a weird one, but it's not too hard to understand. It basically is a nice way of changing the pivot. Okay, now I'm going to come into my turret script. That's basically all the setup for the actual game object itself. And here is where I'm going to start programming the actual turret to do stuff. Actually, one thing I did forget. I need to set up a trigger that the player can walk into to enable this to kind of track him. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the right, I'm going to click Add Component, I'm going to add a box collider. So a box collider is just a collision volume. So by default, it has a capsule collider, which you can see there. And I've just added on a box collider. Now, there's this little is trigger box here. And that basically means when the player walks into it, is he actually going to collide, or is it going to work as an area that will trigger a certain function? So I wanted it to be a trigger, and I'm going to push it forward on the Z value. I'm just going to scale it up so that obviously the sentry can see a bit of a wider view. And just note, this is basically a dirty way of doing it. You could set it up nicely. I could set it so that basically it will... it's kind of hard to describe. I could set it up so that basically what will happen is the player could draw a line to the turret. And if, like, the way the ones, say, in Call of Duty work, they probably work by sending a ray from the player to the turret. And if that ray hits anything that's not the turret, then nothing happens, because obviously you don't want to activate everything. But if that ray to the turret actually hits and the turret connects, then the turret can target that player. That's the way I imagine they would do it, but I'm just going to do it this way. When the player walks into the volume, which you saw me set up here, when the player walks in here, it's going to activate. It's just a dirty way of doing it. It's not very clean, but it's functional. And for now, that's mainly really what I'm going for. I'm going for functionality to show you how it would work. Alright, so a few things that you want to set up. So I want to set up a public game object, and I'm going to call this turret pivot. Or I'm going to call it turret gun head thing. So that's the actual gun piece of the turret which I set up before. And I'm going to leave that blank. I'm not going to assign anything to it for the minute because I'm going to set that manually in the editor later. I'm then going to do public game object, player to target. Okay, and that's all you want to do for variables. No, it isn't. I said it was. I lied. So I'm going to have int damage amount, and I'm going to set this equal to 50. So this turret is going to do 50 damage every time it fires at a player. I'm going to set bool can fire to be true. So can the turret actually fire? and then another boolean which will state should target player. And I'm going to also set that value to false. Actually, that one's going to be a false value, because you don't want it to initially target the player until he walks in this area. I hope you're following along. So if I come into, nothing's actually done in the start function in this. I've already obviously set up the script. I don't do anything in the start function. In the update, I'm going to basically do an if, and I'm going to check whether it should target the player. And if it should target the player, I'm going to set turret gunhead thing, and I'm going to use its transform, so that's its location, rotation, the position, rotation, and scale. And I'm going to then use a function called lookAt. And lookAt, you basically specify a world location value, a vector value, within the world that you want this object to be looking towards. It's a really useful little Unity function for stuff like this. It's not available in everything. You could make one, but thankfully you don't need to. If there's nothing like this in Unreal, I will make one in Unreal to show you guys how that's done later. But for now, I'm just going to use the Unity one. And then you're going to state the, as you can see, the vector3 world position, and that's the position that it's going to look at. So we want it to be the player to target, and we want it to be the transform, and we want it to be the player's position. So basically, whenever this thing should be targeting the player, it's going to look towards the player's position. And then I'm going to check if can fire, not ping. So if the turret can fire, then it's going to begin firing. And you'll kind of see why I'm setting it up this way. But you can see begin fire is turned red because it does not exist in the current context. That's because I've not made the function called begin fire. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to write void begin fire. Now, before I do anything else in this script, I'm going to call it can fire equals false. I'm going to set can fire to be false. That's because, if you remember from previous videos, update happens every single second. No, every frame. So if you are beginning to fire every frame, you're going to be firing a good, 30, 60 times a second, and that's not what we want. So as soon as you've called begin fire, make sure that can fire is equal to false, so it can't just continuously do this. And then I'm going to write, in begin fire, I'm going to write invoke, which basically is a way of calling another method within this script. And then I'm going to open it and I'm going to pass it the argument. So you can see it needs a string method name and a float time. So the string method name is the method that it will activate, and the float time is how long in seconds it will take after this is fired to begin that function. So I'm going to set it to 3 seconds. No, I'm going to call it first off do damage, because that's the function it's going to call, and it's going to happen after 3 seconds. And that's all for this, that bit of the script. I'm going to then make the do damage, and this is where things get a little more involved in terms of cross-script communication. Because basically what I want to be doing is I want to be sending the player a message that it should be hit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first off, to make sure it's working, I'm going to print turret firing, just to make sure that it will be working. It's basically a way of just debugging, making sure that it's working as you intended to. I'm then going to do player to target, and you want to get a component on the player, and the way you do this is you press the dot to access its functions, and you're going to write get component. And the components are all the things I mentioned, like box colliders, your renderers, your colliders, your transform, all that stuff. Any script that you apply to an object can be a component. And I'm going to write player... No, I didn't call it player health script. What did I call it? Shoot for health underscore script. And you have to write get component and then the open arrow kind of thing, and then close the arrow. And then you need to write the 2 brackets at the end. I know getting components is a really weird one. And then you can press the dot and then take damage. And as you'll know, I set it as a public variable, a public function before, and I made it so that it can take an integer like that. So it's a public void take damage. It's a public function, and it takes the value damage amount. And then we're just going to pass it the damage amount that we set here. So you get the player, get its health script component, and you tell it to take damage, and then send it the damage amount which this projectile has. And then once you've told it to take damage, you can set campfire to be true again. Because then, once it's fired and it's hurt the player, it can begin firing again. And the reason I've done it this way, the reason I've done the invoke is kind of a powering up thing, so that it doesn't constantly fire at the player, it takes a few seconds to charge up, then does a massive amount of damage, as opposed to firing loads of rounds, and each one doing a little bit of damage. It fires one, after a few seconds it has to charge up, then fire, does a greater amount of damage. That's the reason I've set it up the way I have. Right, now, going back, I've not actually included the code where it should start tracking the player. And here I'm going to use the on-trigger enter and exit, which I mentioned. So I'm going to write void on trigger enter, and it takes a collider, and I'm going to call this collider C. And then what we're going to do is when something enters this trigger, we're going to check c.gameObject, so the game object which is attached to the object that entered this trigger, and we're going to check the tag, and we're going to set it to be player. So it's going to check if the object that entered the trigger has the tag player, so if it's the player object. And if it is, then player to target will become c.gameObject, so it should target that player. And then should target player equal to true, because at that point the player is entered, that is the object that it will be following the player object, and then should target the player is true, because you want it to start focusing on it. And then I'm going to write the last one, and it's going to be void on trigger exit and collider C, because it can also get the object that's just left as opposed to what's entered. And I'm going to do the same if c.gameObject.tag is equal to player. And if the player leaves, then should target can be equal to false. So when you leave the trigger, it will no longer target you. When you enter the trigger, it will target you. When you leave the trigger, it will no longer target you. If it should target the player, it will look towards the player. If it can fire, it will begin firing. As soon as you begin fire, campfire is false, so it isn't just constantly doing it. Invoke do damage after 3 seconds, charge up and do that. And then after the 3 seconds charging, print to make sure that it's working, get the player health script and tell it to take that amount of damage, and set campfire to be back to true so it can fire at the player a few times. Okay, now if I started playing now, nothing would happen because I've not applied the scripts. So on the turret, we want to apply the turret script. And you can see turret gunhead and player to target are both null at the moment, they have nothing in them. So under turret gunhead thing, I'm going to drag the turret pivot, because you want the object, the pivot point which I set, I want that to be where the I want that to be the object that looks towards the player. I'm going to just set this to be slightly aligned with the bottom of this object. I want to be aligned with the pivot just for my own sanity. Okay, and that's everything for the turret. So it has the turret head pivot which it's going to affect, and it has the code to look towards the player. Oh, sorry. Realised I wasn't in Unity View. All I did was, I'll quickly show you again. My bad. So apply the turret script. See the turret gunhead thing is equal to none. Just drag on the gun, and that's that. Now the player I don't need to set, because it's obviously going to set it, as you can see here, it's going to set that value later on. So if I come over to my player now, and just drop on the health script, so you can see he has health equal to 100, and if I click play, I'm going to quickly open my console. If I come into the area, ooh, okay, it's not liking that. And I can't remember why. Oh, it's because of the fact that these have scripts on them from previous attempts at tutorials. Okay, so it's still not looking towards the player, and I know why that happened as well. Obviously we checked the tag of the player, and I, like a fool, forgot to set it here. So make sure that your player is tagged as player, and I'm going to apply that to the prefab. The prefab is just a pre-made object. Applying here basically applies all these values to it. So if I now come in, you should see it should start looking towards me like that. And after a few seconds, bang, turret fire and damage taken, remaining health 50, and you died. And now it should carry on uh, remaining health minus 50. That's because I didn't actually set up a death script per se. But you can see how that worked. You could see that the player entered, it started tracking the player, it shot at the player took damage, and it all worked pretty much the way I intended. Obviously, like I say, it's a bit of a dirty way to do it, but I never intended this to be like a perfect attempt. It was just a quick way of showing you how to program a couple of little features, and really beyond that, it's best to just kind of experiment on your own, and look up other tutorials, which will teach you other things. If you obviously want me to try and program something else, I will. I will gladly do that. I'll have a look into how I would do it, see if it works, and if it does work, then obviously I'll do a tutorial on that. But for the moment, really mess around, kind of experiment with the sort of things that you've seen me do, um, and yeah, just kind of have a go at it yourself. So that's the end of actually the Unity section. After this, I'll be moving into Unreal. This was just to cover kind of basic normal programming, how you kind of write your scripts manually. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it helped you out a little. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in my Unreal tutorials when I get around to it. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.